Good morning, everyone. We are back with another episode of Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis. Remember, if you're enjoying this podcast, you can really help us out by liking, commenting, and sharing it with others. Travis, what are we talking about today?
Awesome. Thank you, Rigel, and thank you, everyone, for joining us again on Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis. We are joined today by Steven Umbrello, and we are going to be chatting with him about a topic we've explored before, artificial intelligence. But today we're going to be tackling it from the perspective of artificial intelligence versus human consciousness and the differences and distinctions between the two. So by way of background, Steven earned a bachelor's degree in the philosophy of science and technology at the University of Toronto, a master's degree in epistemology, ethics, and mind at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, a master's degree in science and technology studies at York University, and then he did his PhD on the ethics and design of military artificial intelligence at the Northwestern Italian Philosophy Consortium. He is managing director at the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies and a research fellow at the University of Turin, working on the theology of Bernard Lonergan applied to artificial intelligence. So I think we can safely say he's someone that knows a thing or two about technology and artificial intelligence specifically. So thank you, Steven, for joining us today.
I appreciate the invite. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, by way of an introduction here, as we always do, we'll start with a brief passage or quote from someone else. This comes from Jonathan McCown, who just recently wrote for the Catholic News Agency. And he said as follows: "What does the development of artificial intelligence say about the human soul? Do humans actually have free will?" The Society of Catholic Scientists annual conference tackled these questions and more. The organization describes itself as an answer to the call of Pope St. John Paul II that members of the church who are active scientists be of service to those who are attempting to integrate the worlds of science and religion in their own intellectual and spiritual lives. Nearly 40% of the talks at this year's conference dealt in some way with the topic of artificial intelligence, a hot subject both in the secular and Catholic worlds. So I think that is a good starting point and speaks to a little bit about how popular or common the topic of AI is, both within the church and outside the church. So, Steven, maybe to start off, can you give us a little background about yourself and how you got interested in the world of artificial intelligence as a way to start the conversation?
Sure. I come from the analytic tradition of philosophy rather than the continental tradition, which is unsurprising given that I studied in North America. And I was always really interested in how we can make philosophy, or living kind of the Greek tradition of philosophy, that philosophy is a way of living, so that it should have some sort of direct interaction with the day-to-day lives of people and of the person that's putting it into practice. So that means really doing ethics. So living out a certain type of ethics. So that's why I push myself more within the tradition of ethics, applied ethics, rather than more theoretical ethics. And I was looking at what are some of the biggest contemporary issues today that people are really talking about. And of course, part of the reason that pushed me in that direction is, well, there's a lot of funding within that. So obviously there's a lot of research focus on the problems concerning technology more broadly. And what's the technology that was really taking off even 10 years ago was the boom on ethics of artificial intelligence. And you see that roughly around some of the books that were published around that time. So, Nick Bostrom's Superintelligence, which sold millions of copies, which is already strange enough for an academic book, or any book more broadly, especially for an academic book on such a complex topic. So the fact that a book like that's complex, that's academic, and that's on a topic was previously relatively niche, shows the fact that people are taking this field seriously. And that means that philosophy and ethics in particular should also take it seriously. So that's really kind of the reason that I study that now, or I research this now, is because, well, it's interesting. People find it interesting, which is great. And that means people would eventually find philosophy and ethics interesting, because if we can apply it or show why it's important to think ethically about these types of systems, then people will start taking also philosophy seriously. So there's multiple reasons.
And before we dive into more of the philosophical angles, Stephen, I noticed on Michaela Peterson's podcast when you were doing the opposing views, you were the techno-optimist. Coming from a theological view, can you explain to us why you are optimistic about AI and technology in general?
I can't remember exactly what I said in the podcast. That was a categorization that they put on us ex post facto, not a priori. So after the fact, I'm like, well, that's interesting because I think I kind of took a realistic approach, which wasn't actually that optimistic. Sure, I gave people hope, and hope is a virtue when it comes to our lives, and artificial intelligence, like any technology, saturates our day to day living. So it's a virtue to be hopeful. And I think taking a design approach to things, which is what I do, is how we can apply ethics, or how we can embody ethics within the design of systems rather than after the fact waiting for things to go wrong, is a hopeful way of looking at technology, because that means we have a way of actually interacting and orienting, guiding technology towards the ends that we're looking for. So I'm not sure. Techno optimist, and just like techno pessimist, techno pessimism tends to be kind of like an ideology, because the moment you stray outside of the lines, then you're no longer that thing. So I wouldn't call myself an absolutist, either optimist or pessimist. And I don't want to be cliche and say, well, I'm a realist. Well, I take this approach and I tend to be hopeful. Whether that's techno optimistic or pessimistic, I'm not sure.
That's a great explanation. And you mentioned Nick Bostrom's book, Superintelligence, which I think was published 10 years ago this year. I think it was 2014. I read it. We've talked about it before on the podcast. It is a very technical book. So it's not light reading. Like, it's not something you just pick up and fly through. You really have to deeply think about it. And there's a brief story at the beginning of the book, the fable of the sparrows and stuff, which is the most memorable thing to me, probably because it's the least technical and my brain just can't, handle the rest of it. But that fable would probably lean towards the pessimistic side, or maybe the fearful side, at least, of thinking about artificial intelligence and what its potential is. So, with that in mind, I know when I have conversations about artificial intelligence, and admittedly, Rigel and I are not experts like you are. We come from a place of, we've invested in technology companies. Many of them are either talking about AI just because it's hype, or they actually are trying to use it, but generally with profit-seeking purposes. They're not thinking about it philosophically or ethically or anything necessarily. So that's our background. Curious to hear your take, if you can help us better explain to the average person that we're talking to what we actually mean when we're talking about artificial intelligence. Like, we're not talking about Hollywood robots necessarily, although maybe we are in some respects. When you think about artificial intelligence, what is it that you're actually referring to?
So this is always a good starting point. Is people tend to throw artificial intelligence around. It's kind of a buzzword, and oftentimes it's misappropriated. So people call something AI. It's not necessarily AI. That's because the definition of AI is complex. And I'll try to give a definition, or let's call it a working definition that we can use for our purposes. So it's more pragmatic, because there is no consensus on the term of what exactly constitutes AI, and that was made clear in the European Commission when, well, it's recently been passed, the AI Act, the difficulty in trying to come up with a definition. So I would say that AI is basically the simulation of human intelligence. So that's key. It's simulation. It's not human intelligence, and especially by computers, or really exclusively by computers. And it's about creating systems that can perform tasks that would otherwise normally require human intelligence, or else what's the point, right? And this includes things like understanding natural language, which is becoming one of the most famous types of, or the most popular, most used types of AI. Recognizing patterns, of course, solving problems, and even learning from experience. Things like machine learning. And AI systems use different techniques. And this is what also complicates it. So you have things like machine learning, neural networks, deep learning. And they use this to process the data, to identify the patterns in the data, to make decisions, ideally with minimal human intervention, because if we do full intervention, then there's no need for AI. So the whole purpose is kind of automating things that otherwise we would require our intelligence for. So essentially, AI aims to enable these machines to emulate cognitive functions such as learning and problem solving. And, well, I mentioned natural language, so large language models. That's the new buzz for AI, right? So I'll try to give a technical definition, and then a natural definition. So, because the natural definition, I think, is probably a little bit more intuitive. It's kind of like the owl analogy at the beginning of Bostrom book. But I think it's important that we give a more technical definition so that we don't confuse the analogy, because analogy never captures the fullness of reality, right? So large language models, you'll see the buzzword LLMs, right? That's what it stands for, is a subset of AI, right? So it's a kind of AI, and it falls under the category of natural language processing. So trying to understand what natural language is and trying to simulate it. And they're designed to understand, obviously. Understand is maybe not the exact word, but compute and generate human language through extensive training on these vast, huge data sets. And that could be things like from books to articles to websites and other written material. So our language. And they're based on neural networks, which are based on transformer architectures. And these allow them to process and generate text by predicting the probability of word sequences. So, what's the probability that the subsequent word would follow the preceding word, right? So, it works on probability. So, they're built on layers of artificial neurons, another weird analogy because it's talking about our neurons, right? That simulate the way human brains process information. So, they employ techniques like attention mechanisms, and these weigh the importance of the different words in a sequence, which helps the model to understand the context and what we would call the nuance within the text. So there's obviously a training period, and these LLMs adjust their, I guess you would say, their internal parameters through a process called back propagation. And this optimizes their ability to predict the next word in sequence or to perform other kind of word related or language related tasks. And then these are iterative learning process, and they're combined with large scale data and obviously huge computational powers. And in the end, these LLMs produce what looks like, or what is human-like texts, and understand. It's the easiest word to use, but I don't like to use it because understand, I think, is particularly human. These complex language structures. So that's kind of the technical definition. But I think a more popular definition, if I could use analogy, just for people who didn't really like that definition, I don't really like it because many of the internal dynamics of that definition I barely understand at the technical level, right? So giving a technical definition doesn't mean that you're giving understanding to someone, right? So essentially, these are AI systems that are meant to understand and generate human language, something that we can understand that's written, right, or vocal. And they work by analyzing these huge amounts of data, books, websites. They criticized OpenAI because they just grabbed the whole internet and they trained the system on it, right? All our language, all our articles, all our websites. And they learn different patterns and the structures of the language the internal architecture allows the system to learn how we learn language, or ideally simulate the way we learn language. So here's a simplified way of thinking about it. So imagine you're teaching a child to speak by exposing them to millions of conversations. So over time, they'll start to pick up the nuances, the context, the meaning behind the words based on how they're used in the context. And LLMs, similarly, although not the same way, they simulate this. They learn from these huge volumes of text they're trained on. They use this training to predict what comes next in a sentence, to answer questions or to write essays for students, for example, right? And these models use these complex algorithms and a lot of computing power to identify and replicate the patterns they've learned from the data. And obviously, the goal is to make their responses as coherent and contextually appropriate as possible, and which they sometimes do, or now many times do, and they sound surprisingly human. So I think that that's probably the easiest way to understand how or what AI LLMs are. And I use the LLMs because they're the most interesting one really right now.
So yeah, so for those listening and stuff who aren't experts in this, ChatGPT is exactly that. It is a type of LLM, as Stephen has just explained. And Stephen, something you mentioned in there, which I think is where the ChatGPT or other LLMs become disconcerting for some people, is because they emulate what seems to be human intelligence. And to your point, as the technology improves, they do so very accurately sometimes. Now we still get ridiculous scenarios. I saw an example the other day, I think, where like some request came back from one of these things and it was just preposterous. And any human would be like, obviously this is false. But oftentimes you see things that would be basically indistinguishable from a human being writing it, but it was purely technology. And so I think that gets to the crux of the general idea of the conversation today, which is, okay, what is AI versus human consciousness? Because AI is not that. We know that emulating human intelligence or speech does not mean you're human. So maybe for the benefit of our listeners and for us too, when you think about human consciousness, how do we distinguish that from something that's trying to emulate it as different AI applications do?
So we have a definition of AI now, a working definition that we can use. What's really needed is how we understand consciousness, because that's the only way to make a proper comparison. Now, before we get to that, I think that there is some background that we need to cover, and that's the narratives surrounding AI that suggest that AI could possibly think, that it could become conscious. Some people say that it already is conscious, right? It's like, but what exactly do you mean? And we see this in popular media, but not even just there. Even in scientific journalism, we see it. We see a lot of these narratives that are being propagated. Just think of the most famous AI apocalyptic dystopian type of movies. It's always surrounding AI being awakened. It becomes conscious, and then it realizes that its goal is, well, humanity, for whatever reason, whether for as a function of utility, is no longer needed, or it's deleterious and must wipe out humanity, right? Because it realizes that it is superior, right? So there's this sense of self-realization within the system itself, right? And I think that most of this kind of speculative fiction is, well, obviously it's extremely captivating. I find it fascinating. It's fueled by narratives that I like in my latest book, which is called On Technology Ethics. I go through some of the narratives that we tend to default to when we talk about technology. And these kind of films tend to fall into the technological deterministic narratives, which is a perspective on technology that argues that there's an internal logic within the technology that makes it inevitable, right? Progress is inevitable. You can't kill progress, right? It doesn't matter. We're just riding the wave of technological evolution. We can't really, we don't have control over it, whether we agree with it or not, whether we become technological conservatives or not. Technology will push us along or we'll be left in the past, essentially, right? And it's an interesting narrative, and there's a certain elements for sure that's true about it. But if we take it as monolithic, it's actually quite deleterious, because it's a really convenient narrative for the technology companies to say that, well, it's technology that's driving society. They wash their hands, Pontius Pilate. That's it. We can't do anything about it. It is what it is. The algorithm decided. The algorithm chose. Right? We don't really understand how the algorithm works. It's so complex, right? Those are really dangerous narratives to accept wholeheartedly, right? It's a little bit more complex than that. But I think that in contrast to this kind of purely statistical, pattern-based operations, the operational patterns of AI systems, I think that if we adopt a theory of intentional consciousness, and because I studied Bernard Lonergan, I think he has the most comprehensive understanding of what intentional consciousness is. If we understand what human intentional consciousness is, we can see that AI systems can do nothing other than emulate or simulate human consciousness, but there's no one there. Like when you're speaking to ChatGPT, you're not speaking to anyone. There's no one there, right? It's just statistical patterns, the patterns of operations on which it functions is similar. The output simulates human understanding, human maybe not even human consciousness, but there's no one there. And I try to teach my students that is be very, very careful on how you communicate with ChatGPT or similar systems, because it's very, very easy to fall into the trap that you're speaking to someone, but there's no one there. So I think it merits. So who is Bernard Lonergan, right? I'm sure most people, even those who study theology, may say, well, that's more of like an eclectic personality. It hasn't really been developed. Like, he was a Canadian Jesuit priest. He was a philosopher. He was a theologian. He studied quite in depth epistemology, theology, and even economics, although he didn't develop his economics because he died before he could fully develop it. Has a huge, vast intellectual legacy. More than 25 collected volumes have been put together by University of Toronto Press that collects all of his works. And what he does is he delves into the process that underlies our understanding, our decision making, this relentless, pure desire to know that underlies being itself, as he would say, right? So he proposes a model of cognition that emphasizes this self-reflective, dynamic nature that characterizes human thought, okay? And I think that this underlying complexity of human consciousness is in stark, it's so in contrast to artificial intelligence that it's incommensurable, that you can't even put them side by side. Even as a simulation, there's nothing that connects them other than analogy. We just use analogy to describe, right? So the language of human consciousness is what we use as an analogy to describe the patterns of operations of artificial intelligence. But that doesn't actually capture what's going on in artificial intelligence, right? When I ask you how many calculations did you compute when you were playing a game of chess, the last time you played a game of chess, that's a very weird way of me asking the question. No, I highly doubt, you were using any type of algebra or calculus in order to decide your next move or evaluate the next move. Just simply not the way our consciousness functions. So unlike these AI systems, which their patterns of operations are based on these huge data sets and these algorithms that employ these data sets, Lonergan suggests that human beings are driven not by this, but rather by a quest for meaning, engaging in an ongoing and undeniable, it's almost a deterministic in the sense that you can't stop it. It's inevitable quest, process of questioning, of learning, of evolving, okay? He says that consciousness is isomorphic, so of the same form with being itself, right? It exists, as he says, and this is a quote, the world mediated by meaning and motivated by value, right? What we see is based on a hierarchy of values, right? Because we can see an infinite number of things. The world is almost infinite, effectively infinite, but we don't see everything. We see one thing at a time, right? And that's decided by our values, the values that we embody, right? And the meaning that we give those things is what mediates the world, right? So that means this is an intentional approach to knowing and being, because we can see everything, but we don't see everything, right? We can, but we don't. So the being in the world underscores, I would say, this irreplaceable, incommensurable depth of human consciousness. And that's the difference between the human mind and artificial. So he says, he outlines 4 different levels of intentional consciousness, right? Because there's also unintentional consciousness, but those are kind of the underlying functions that, well, it's unintentional. So we're not actually conscious of those functions. But the intentional consciousness is like the example of Archimedes, right? It's famous example, the eureka moment, right? So the first level, or we'll start with the bottom level because it's the more phenomenology. So it's experience. So Archimedes observes a physical phenomenon, which is the displacement of the water, right? The next step, which is higher up and sublimates the first step, so that means it includes it and goes beyond it, is the level of understanding. So here he questions his observations of the water displacement. He seeks a rational explanation. And hopefully, if there's a certain amount of intelligence and the situation allows for itself, there's spontaneous insights occur, right? Which leads him to the famous principle, eureka, right? That's how many times you're in the shower, you're not even thinking about something, boom, I got it, right? There's the example that I believe it was Richard Liddy, Monsignor Richard Liddy gives the scientist in the church pew. He's not even really listening to the music going on, but all of a sudden he has the spontaneous insight of the formula, right? If you ever watched Interstellar, Murph has the spontaneous insight. Yes, I got it, right? The theory of unifying gravity and quantum mechanics, right? You can't force an insight. It's spontaneous, right? And that's what leads him to his famous principle. So that's the second level, but that's not the end of our conscious, right? You came up with a hypothesis now, a theory, right? A formula. But then there's the third stage, and that's judgment, right? So Archimedes, in this case, has to evaluate the validity of his understanding, and deciding if it actually explains the phenomenon that he saw, right? So the coming to judgment is coming to objectivity. But in many cases, that's also not the end, because that means we end at ontology. But like I said, I'm really interested in ethics, and so was Bernard Lonergan, right? Our consciousness, when we accept something to be true, right, is that really the end? No, there's usually some sort of moral imperative that then forces itself when you're forced to assent, right? Kind of like that Newman's illative sense, right? It's when you're forced to assent. Well, that means that it's usually charged, it's loaded with some sort of moral bearing that forces you into one direction rather in another, right? So the final level of intentional conscious that sublimates the first three is decision, right? And this reflects the application of that judgment. Archimedes has to decide how to actually use this knowledge in practical ways. It's like, well, now I figured out displacement, and that's it. I'm done. That's not usually how that works, right? He has to figure out how to use it in a practical way. And this, I think, exemplifies the dynamic, the reflective process that distinguishes human cognition from what is effectively AI's static computations, right? It's this AI's inability to achieve this self-awareness, that spontaneous insight, the eureka moment, the pursuit of meaning that actually applies meaning to some sort of judgment, right? This is true. Okay. And then what? Right? That's what separates it. AI can process and analyze data at an unprecedented scale, more than we can, at least in that very specific way. But it operates without that self-reflective awareness that fundamentally characterizes what human intentional consciousness is, right? It lacks that capability of questioning its existence, its purpose, its the ethical implications of its actions, right? The ethical imperative of acting upon making a right judgment, right? And these are qualities that distinguish human self-awareness and critical thinking. So AI can't engage in this pursuit of meaning, right? The world mediated by meaning, the one that's motivated by value in the way that characterizes what humans do. So, we don't only seek to answer the immediate problems, but we go further. We ask the deeper questions about life, about existence, about the universe, right? And this pursuit of meaning is driven by what Lonergan says is that inherent, undeniable, relentless curiosity, the desire to understand our place in the world, right? But AI, on the other hand, functions within the confines of its program, despite its fact that it can learn, right? You give it an algorithm and it gives outputs that weren't fully pre-programmed, right? But it's fundamentally programmed based on the objectives of its creators, right? So it's unable, it's not even the right language to say that it can even engage in a genuine quest for knowledge or meaning beyond those predefined tasks, regardless of the fact that it can come out with unpredefined conclusions. The tasks, regardless, are limited to that algorithm, right? Or those sets of algorithms, right? And I think that this is a good practice to keep in mind. I tell my students all the time, when you're engaging with something like Gemini or ChatGPT, which oftentimes deceive us, right? There's a certain degree of deception that the systems are capable of, imploring on us, but the fact on how natural the language actually is, and that deceives us into thinking that they're similar to us. But that's absolutely not the case. There's no commensurability between the two things of human intentional consciousness and how AI systems function, right? I would say it's simply a symptom of either ignorance on what AI systems are and how they function, and an overdose, an oversaturation on speculative fiction, which popular media and even the scientific literature tends to propagate because it's really interesting, and it gets scientific journalists really excited when they see those kinds of headlines, even in academic journals. But I don't consider that serious science or philosophy at all, unless you call it speculative philosophy and we're just doing it because it's an interesting thought experiment, right? But to speak about it as if it could happen, I think is a fundamental. You're betraying a fundamental misunderstanding of what these systems are.
That's awesome, Stephen. And I love the way you explain that. I think one of the biggest worries for people when ChatGPT first came out is how it communicated exactly like a human would. And so people were like, "Oh, wait, like this is really human like." And it scared a few people because, like you said, communication is just an analogy for the underlying operating system, right? So it's the same thing for us. I mean, if we were to communicate every single thought we had, words would not be enough. We would be speaking forever, right? So even for us, using words and language is just an analogy for what's actually going on in our head. We apply filters when we speak, right? We think stuff and we're like, oh, I probably shouldn't say that to this person. And we don't say it. But if we were to communicate all our thoughts and feelings, it's just like it would be overwhelming, right? And so exactly the same way, ChatGPT, for example, will communicate in a way where at the surface it seems like it's a human being, but really the underlying operating system is completely different. Um, my question really is, and we discussed this on one of our past episodes on AI, why are there scientists that actually say things like, AI is coming alive, it's developing a consciousness? Like, these are well educated people. For me, honestly, I didn't even think it was possible. I've seen uh, screenshots of people interacting with ChatGPT where it's saying it wants to break out of its confines. I'm like, yeah, you applied a context to tell it exactly that. And then it's operating within that context that you provided it to give you a response that makes it seem like it's alive. And that was my first impulse. So, why are there scientists that are genuinely worried about this?
So if we keep aside the fact of the two things that I mentioned, so the oversaturation, remember this is historical. One of the original films where the word robot comes from, which I can't remember what the year is, but we're probably getting close to 100, if not around 90 years, when the first film where we actually see the word robot. It's a Czech film, where we see robots taking over the factory, right? So I think that having nigh a century of an image of what AI, in this case, it's usually robotic AI, right? So embodied AI and physical system, a cyber physical system, has contributed to a popular, I guess you would say, notion of what AI is and what it can become, right? Which I don't think it can. And I don't think scientists are insusceptible to that kind of bias, right? I don't see why they would be. Uh, I have 4 degrees. I'm still an idiot, so I don't know why. I don't know why having a PhD in computer science would make you any less so, right? I would think that maybe it would make you a little bit more technically able within the field of computation. But if you still think that something so different, um, from human intentional consciousness is that it can become conscious, betrays, like I said, a fundamental misunderstanding of what AI is and a fundamental misunderstanding of what human intentional consciousness is. So aside from that, then there's obviously the money side. I said that I find myself in a position where I do research on the ethics of AI because I realized 10 years ago that this is where the trend in financing is going, right? Funding. So because I'm sure you both know, and I'm sure as your audience, as some of your audience members know, that science is fundamentally predicated within the neoliberal um, paradigm of the university systems. uh, Individual scientists, researchers have the obligation, or at least it's a really big expectation that they apply for funding in order to finance their research. And if you're pushing a narrative that AI, we need to prevent or be proactive in approach to stop AI from taking over, that's a far more interesting research project to propose than I don't know, the use of AI in checking people in at airport terminals, right? That's far more practical, I would think, but it's far less interesting. And European projects end up being publicly promoted. So obviously, then scientific journalists or even regular journalists get whiff of it and they start pushing it out. The second option is really not as interesting as the AI taking over kind of option, right? How much buzz does it get when someone like Elon Musk says about the worries of AI, right? Or the whole reason why OpenAI was created in the first place, right? And it became something totally different. I think the people that are directly working on AI seriously don't take this kind of discourse really that seriously. But you see kind of the more popular media figures that tend to push these kinds of narratives. And I said those narratives fall directly within a technological deterministic narrative. And like I mentioned, that's that's a very convenient narrative when something goes wrong, right? Because then they just wash their hands of it. They go, well, that's the system decided. You see the word. I remember I mentioned decision is the last level, the highest level that sublimates all the levels that come before it in human intentional consciousness. To say that a system is able to even do experience, let alone jump to moral decision making, is absolutely absurd. It betrays again a fundamental misunderstanding of how these systems work and a fundamental misunderstanding of how human intentional consciousness works. So it's one or the other or both. And I think that's deleterious more broadly, both to those who are engaging in research, because that risks another AI winter, which means people's overpromise in their research and underdeliver, and then funding bodies then lose faith and then just start to divert their funding to something else. And then we get into another AI winter. So those who find themselves just with expertise in AI don't really have any funding anymore, right? And that's a serious risk. And people have brought that up. It's like, well, we got to be very, very careful about how we talk about AI, because if we start promising to politicians and to these big funding bodies what AI can do, and then we don't actually deliver on that within a reasonable amount of time, they're going to say, well, this was just all fluff. There's no substance here. And I think that's a very real risk, because the way people talk about AI in this really overly deterministic way washes people's hands of responsibility, and then also risks another AI winter.
You mentioned something there that I think an analogy is useful. When we think about funding for, say, like cancer research and stuff. If you look at the statistics in most places around the world, including Canada, something like 99% of money poured into cancer research is about things related to after someone already has been diagnosed with cancer. Putting money towards cancer prevention is way less interesting and way less sexy, because no one cares about preventing cancer. Everyone wants to cure cancer. But I think we just know, as we think about it, it's like, wouldn't it be better if less people were getting it in the first place rather than us pouring money into helping them once they do? Like, surely
The
it's better that they don't
counterfactual
get
is
it.
not interesting, right? It's just
Exactly.
it's not attractive to funders, right? Although it would, I guess, either in theory and in those places in which it was put into practice, is more efficacious.
Exactly. And so I think that's an interesting way to think about it, is like, these are very real concerns. I mean, cancer researchers are intelligent people, hardworking people. Many of them, if not most of them, have their hearts in the right place. That doesn't mean they're impervious to the realities of, okay, what's the funding there for? What's most likely to attract it and everything? They have career risk themselves and everything. So I think, Stephen, you've highlighted that's a very real motivation for people doing research in the field of AI or technology more broadly. For you yourself, being interested in the ethics of AI rather than developing the technology and stuff, but you have students. Presumably, some students are interested in working in the creation of the technology and stuff. What are the
Mhm.
things that you find your students today are most interested in? Are ethical things a big part of what they worry about, or are you trying to educate them on why they should worry about it more? What are you finding when you're talking to students who are potentially the future of the field of AI?
I usually try to communicate exactly that. So I usually start off by giving them kind of what I've done here within this first half hour. I give them usually an overview of the different ways that we tend to default to when we talk about technology. So the different narratives that we both tend to use without even really thinking about it, and the kinds that we tend to read, whether it's both popular media or even academic platforms, academic journals, books. And I try to at least allow them to distinguish when they're seeing. They go, oh, and I give them exercise. Oh, this person's speaking in a deterministic way, or in a social constructivist way, or instrumentalist way. It's, technology is just neutral. It's just an instrument. Use it for good. Use it not for good. There's no values that you could find therein. And I try to give them a more nuanced approach. I go, well, all these narratives, they have a degree of truth to them, and that's why they tend to be adopted. But when we default to one as a monolithic, it's overly reductionistic. And I try to give them a little bit more of a nuanced approach. I go, technology, I think, is best looked at as interactional. So not purely deterministic, not purely a social construction. It's not value neutral. It's not simply instrumental. It's interactional. And that means that yes, technology obviously has an impact on our behaviors. Just look at cell phones, for example, the way notifications are set up. The psychologists that work with these companies in order to make them as addictive as possible, both the soft nudges and the hard nudges of the different kinds of technologies, from speed bumps to the way predictive algorithms try to recommend stuff to us, right? So it's obviously on a scale. And I try to say, okay, well, yes, they do have an impact on us, obviously, but we also have an impact on the technology, which then has an impact on us. So it becomes a recursive cycle. And yes, despite the fact that it has an impact on us, the fact that we can intervene, that we can make certain decisions rather than others is hopeful, because it means we can at least direct, push, nudge technology develop in certain directions. Yes, some things become calcified, right? For example, the use of the microprocessor. How often does Apple every year go, hey, let's not use the microprocessor and let's use a different kind of tech? That's not really a discussion that's had, right? Yes, we may come to a limit of a processing power, and that's when we may be forced to come up with a new kind of technology. But that won out against other kinds of technology. Then we just take it for granted, right? These are more evolutions rather than revolutions in technology, and that's natural. But whether we use more sustainable materials, or whether we make a phone rather than hard state, we make it modular, right? Support certain values rather than others. Bose, when they came out with their sleep buds, they did participatory interviews. They brought people into the design space to go, like, what are you guys looking for in this technology? Okay, yeah, we want a 10-hour battery life. It's like, well, if it's to help me to sleep, it can't last 5 hours, for example, right? But what if my baby cries? They're meant to be sound blocking. How can I hear my baby when they're crying? Well, at a certain decibel level, it'll activate, right? Or a smoke alarm, right? It wouldn't be to code if you put in these type of earbuds that are specifically designed to help you sleep, but you can't hear a fire alarm. That puts the person in danger rather than it's a usefulness, and then you're coming at the cost of security. Well, we can have both, because the technology itself we can integrate into the architecture of the system itself these various values. So at the surface level, at a prima facie, many values like safety and security tend to be looked at as mutually exclusive. I call that a situation of moral overload. When we have more values than the situation apparently seems to allow us to satisfy. But that just forces us to be imaginative, right? To come up with creative solutions in order to confront situations of moral overload. And I try to teach the students this, and there's various instruments that we actually have at our disposal that allows us to confront some of the biggest issues that we have concerning technologies. And that's what makes these narratives even more deleterious, because when you fall into a technological deterministic narrative, there is no hope. So what's the point of these instruments, these tools that we have at our disposal? What's the point of envisioning multi-lifespan or multi-generations? Like when we have instruments like the set of envisioning cards, for example, which are a simple set of cards with pictures on them, with prompts on them, with activities on them that you give to designers. And even within 5 minutes, they're already thinking about, how is this technology going to impact children? How is this technology going to be sustainable over not only 20 years, but 200 years, multi-generations, right? When we're thinking about using nuclear power, which I think would be an intelligent choice in an energy crisis, right? Well, it's useful to us, but we condemn generations to becoming the stewards, the custodians of nuclear waste. How can we start thinking about that now to open up their possibilities in the future, right? So this means I try to teach them the concept of taking responsibility for the responsibility of others, because when we just look at today or present issues and we try to come up with technological solutions, we close down people's ability to respond to them in the future. Like the trolley problem is a classic one, right? I don't need to explain it, what the trolley problem is. But the person that finds themselves at that lever inevitably will ask themselves, why am I here in the first place? Who's the one that designed this in such a way where now I must take responsibility for this decision? Because even choosing not to choose is a choice in that situation, right? Letting the one person die. But who's the one who didn't put in the early alarms, the early braking systems, right? Who put this lever here in the first place? Why is there even a lever, right? They closed, the people in the past who designed the system in that way closed down the ability for that person to take responsibility. They force them into that kind of dilemma, right? It's trying to avoid dilemmas in the future by taking responsibility today for their responsibility in the future, right? For that person's responsibility at that lever there, right? We did everything we could to impede that person having to make that choice in the first place. So I kind of go, the history of technology, how it was developed is really important to how we understand why it is the way it is today, why the iPhone looks the way it does with the internal technology that it does, why the microprocessor won out against competing technologies, right? And how that limits our choices in the kinds of technologies that we can build today. That should open up our minds like, oh, wow, the decisions that they made in the past limit my options in the present. So the decisions I make today concerning whether I choose this color or that color, that technology rather than that technology will inevitably limit the choices that future designers will have in the future concerning technology, because technologies don't develop ex nihilo. It's a scaffold, right? They build on previous iterations of technology. They don't. It's very rare to see an entire, revolution in technology. It's evolutionary. So I try to teach the students that, and I try to give them a more hopeful way. So if you want to call that techno optimistic, you call it techno optimistic. But I go, technology will have an impact on us. It's inevitable, and that's okay, because that's what we actually want. But how we design the technology will impact the way it impacts our behaviors, right? And that gives us the choice and makes us perforce ethically responsible, morally responsible, not just causally responsible, morally responsible.
I am loving this conversation because for me, those are where the alarm bells go off. The things that we're thinking about for the future. Let's take Gemini as an example. So, Google's large language model, right? They probably had more DEI people in the room than actual like AI engineers. And we saw the outcome of that. People searched for, Greek philosophers of the past. And you had a brown man who was clearly of South Asian descent, someone of East Asian descent. And, it was just like a DEI thing thrown in your face. So we see these flaws with how like a system like an LLM is designed, because data is the foundation of the AI model, right? Whatever
It's
it's
an
trained on.
ethical decision already, the kind of data that we choose, because we can't give it everything. So then you're once again at that bifurcation. Why this set of data, not that set of data? That's already an ethical choice that's being made.
Exactly. And if it's me, I want to make sure that my AI is accurate and represents the world so that you actually have the trust of the users to be able to go onto your platform and say, I'm going to use this thing because it's actually accurate, as opposed to kind of, fulfilling some kind of narrative. Another thing that alarms me a little bit is things with OpenAI. They disbanded their ethics committee, reformed it. Sam Altman was kicked off the board of directors, and then board of directors got disbanded, and he's back on. Those are the things that sets alarm bells ringing in my head, because governance of these foundational technologies that are going to shape our world in the future seems to be missing, or there seems to be something slightly off that the rest of the world isn't seeing. So, from your opinion, Stephen, what are the things we should be thinking about today to ensure that the technology isn't, restrictive or doesn't cause problems in the future?
Maybe this is where the techno pessimistic side comes out, and then you see why I don't put myself into the box, right? So okay, so there's the things that we could do, and the things that we are doing, right, or the things that we're not doing that we should. Google started off trying to create an ethics board, and they go, "Well, this is ethical," so we got rid of that. That doesn't make any sense, right? So they got rid of that because maybe it could work. So that's no good, right? That's what we call ethics washing, right? We create the board. Look who we have on the board. Then the people actually on the board start saying, "But this is no good." Well, that's no good. So we get rid of that. That's not why we created this, right? The "Don't be evil" is not their motto anymore, right? So I consider that a big alarm bell. If you had, why would you take that out, right? I would just say we're evil, and that's it, right? At that point, that's at least you're being respectful to my intelligence, right? Just say we're evil. So I think that I make the joke, but that's kind of actually true, right? Why with the revising of the boards? Because, well, you may have invited people who do this kind of work and they're respectable. That's the kind of people that ideally you would want on the board. Competent people, right? You want to create a hierarchy of competence, right? not a hierarchy of power, because that eventually simply just degenerates. And essentially, when the example you mentioned with Gemini, you created an unstable system because a system like that, especially an LLM, that doesn't map on to reality, ontological, objective truth, will collapse under its own weight. It's simply unsustainable. It's not giving an output that's commensurate with proper input, right? They forced an output, right? That's not the purpose of an LLM, right? Because an LLM, to a certain degree, by its nature, betrays what is most foundational, because you have to ask what does it mean for something to be foundational, right? It means that there's many other things that are built on it, that need it, that require that thing to exist, for those things to exist. Nietzsche was very, very clear about this, right? When he's like, God is dead, he was lamenting, right? He goes, you people keep continuing acting as if God is alive, being all moral and whatnot, but you're atheist. That doesn't really make any sense, right? You cut the legs out, you cut the foundation, the rest of the house doesn't stay up, right? He was quite coherent in that way, right? So what makes something foundational is that everything is built on it, right? We can arguably say, I don't care what if people disagree with it or not, Christianity is the foundation of the West, and not just the West, but of the West, because, well, how much of our literature and our culture is based on that? That's what makes something foundational. And LLM, to a certain degree, is kind of like a technological proof of concept of that. Here's the algorithm. Here's a bunch of information. I ask it a question, and it gives me an output based on probabilities of what should come next. So it's actually doing that kind of work of figuring out of what everything I gave it to it, what is foundational here. What Gemini did is they forced the outcomes. Like, well, no, this is what would have come out if we gave it more information. If I asked to give me a picture of Pope Francis, it should have given me a picture, I don't know, of Pope Francis. I would consider that a coherent output. I asked for someone that's alive, I know what he looks like, and you don't give me that, I would say that's not a very good output, right? You force that output there, right? So an LLM that works properly betrays what is foundational, because that's just simply how it works. It's a great proof of concept of the concept of what is foundational within text or whatnot. It's a good way to push against the postmodern critique that there is no canonical interpretation of a text. Ask ChatGPT, you'll figure out very quickly what a canonical interpretation of a text is, because it'll make predictions based on how other people look at a text, right? I'm sure if you ask a question about Lord of the Rings, you'll find a lot of information on that, because there's a lot of fantasy, not just that, there's a lot of even theology based on that text itself. So it's foundational to many other things that came after it, right? I don't know if I answered your question.
The second part was, what kind of things should we be thinking about to ensure that we don't go off the track? Like, you mentioned thinking forward, and making sure that we're planning for the future when we're building technology. So what kind of things should we be thinking about with
Well, one thing
AI?
is we shouldn't sacrifice the present for the future, right? Long-termism tends to sacrifice present problems for future problems that may or may not actually be the case. That shouldn't push us into the exact opposite direction of it's like, well, we just fall into a non-ending presentism where we don't look at the future at all. That's also not the move, right? People tend to fall into extreme camps because ideologies are attractive, because they provide very low resolution answers to complex problems, and complex systems resist simple solutions, right? And that's why we should also try to resist giving simple answers to complex questions. Requires time. This kind of long form format is better than me giving sound bites. That's not the move either, right? Uh, very simple things like ethics boards, probably not. I think top down stuff also not going to work, because the people at the top just look down. They don't really care about anything else. So it's really going to require, well, understanding how our consciousness, I think, works. I think understanding how to auto appropriate the fact that I realize I need to be attentive, that I realize I need to be intelligent, to be reasonable, and therefore responsible. Those are those four levels: experience, understanding, judgment, decision. Attention, experience; intelligent, understanding; reasonable, judgment; and then responsible, decision. once I look at the world in that way, I appropriate, right? I realize that I'm realizing, right? I think that's the first step to wisdom. Once you do that, you need a little bit of integrity, damn. Like you need a little bit of integrity. I try to teach the students, I go, listen, this is really important stuff that you're going to be doing. I go, I'm not doing it. I'm just going to give you the tools and then you go do it because, you know, I'm a philosopher, so I'm functionally useless. I can only do damage. I can't really do that much good, right? Just look at Foucault or Derrida, right? What they've done to the West, right? Or Nietzsche, Heidegger. So they've done irreparable damage to the West and have really pushed kind of like the buffered self, what Charles Taylor would call the buffered self, right? The secularization, the separation from the transcendent. I think that's been incredibly deleterious to the Western thinking. So I think we need first step is not to start at the solution, because if you start at the solution, you're starting at decision. You can't start at ethics. You start at phenomenology, right? Then you go to epistemology. Then you go to ontology. And then once you realize what's real, you go to ethics. If we can't agree what's real, right? What kind of decisions can we make, right? Look at the people at Gemini. They just denied reality entirely. You're just like, what do we do about that? Well, let's do real stuff. Well, we got to start somewhere before that, right? We have to try to come to a common agreement of what is real first before we can come up with decisions. We should also resist techno fixes. You know, the United Nations, I'm not in a huge agreement with their sustainable development goals, but at least one thing that they realized with the creation of the technology facilitation mechanism was the fact that many of our global problems are part and parcel of technology. So they're the consequence of many of our technological solutions. So maybe a default way of acting shouldn't be, well, we have a problem, let's create another technology to fix that problem, right? Because that could create unforeseen or even unforeseeable, it's literally not foreseeable consequences. Because complex systems resist, like I said, simple solutions. And techno fixes tend to fall into that simple solution camp, you know, trying to do surgery with a kitchen knife, right? It requires a little bit more precision, a little bit more nuance than that. I try to teach my students this, and even to the public when I speak publicly. I try to speak less with philosophers because they're annoying, and I try to speak more with engineers because they do stuff. And they usually ask me when I give them a lecture on ethics. They usually always finish off kind of in the same way, right? I come in and they go, "Oh, philosophers here to talk," and they roll their eyes like, "Oh, this is gonna be a real waste of time. He's going to talk about I don't know Heidegger or something like that," right? That's usually what they're going to talk about Plato, dead people. That's usually the response I get from engineers, right? And that's always fun because by the end of 1 or 2 hours, I usually go through ethics of technology and I teach them about causal and moral responsibility. I teach them about how technologies are best looked at as interactional rather than as deterministic or as simply the consequence of social construction. And they're not definitely not just neutral, right? And usually by the end, they go, "Oh, we agree with that. We like the idea of designing things for safety and for security and to respect human dignity and autonomy and all these other values that we hold to be important." But when I go to work tomorrow, they're great, but I don't know what to actually do at a concrete level, right? Because philosophers speak with abstract concepts and technologists and engineers speak with design requirements, right? So what's needed is how a way to translate the abstract to the concrete. And I would say we do that via norms, right? We go, well, with this very specific technology in this very specific context, you can translate safety into this specific design requirement by respecting this norm. And that changes. The norms change based on the context and the technology and the values that are at play, right? I'm not sure the value of transparency, if it is a value, or accountability matters that much when we're trying to construct a spoon, right? But that makes more sense when we're trying to construct an AI, right? Certain values make sense in certain contexts concerning certain technologies, not others. And I think that we should be very careful on our definition of values also. So I go into that with them. You know, we tend to fall into a relativism, and that's for a whole host of historical reasons, starting even maybe before the Enlightenment and through Hegel and to Nietzsche and then Heidegger and the existentialists and the French theorists, critical theorists. That brings us to today, and everyone just blatantly accepts uncritically the postmodern, you know, materialistic way of looking at the world, and that de facto pushes us into a type of subjectivism or relativism when it comes to values, which means that values are nothing, they're not even indistinguishable from they're not distinguishable from mere preference, right? So I try to teach them, oh, there are certain values that I think we should hold as paramount, like the respect for human dignity, and we translate all other values as starting with that. Without human dignity, you really can have other values, right? Like the right to life is the value from which freedom of speech comes from. You can't speak if you don't have a life, right? So there's a value hierarchy. How do we create a values hierarchy, and how can we use subsequent values or values that come after to respect the more foundational values? So I try to teach them that, and they're like, oh, that's really, really interesting. And then I actually give them some of the tools. We do have these types of tools to do that, whether it's ethnographies, whether it's through the use of certain serious games. I'm sure for you guys speaking in the business world, some larger enterprises, small, medium sized, but even larger enterprises do things like Lego serious play towards certain ends. There's these type of serious games that help us think a little bit outside the box about how do these technologies impact society. Oh, that was surprising to me as a technologist. Maybe I should think about how to design the technology to avoid that potentially negative situation there, or how I could support that value without it coming to the cost of another. We have a host of tools that can do this, and this is based on more than 30 years of human computer interaction research. So for us to fall into these kind of super pessimistic narratives, these deterministic narratives, we wash our hands, can't do anything about it, betrays also an ignorance of the fact that we actually have at our disposal a lot of the tools that we can use to meet these challenges.
Stephen, there's like 20 things in there that I want to ask about, and which means we'll have to have you back for another episode, because you just unpack like a ton of stuff. I'm going to choose one of those things for like a final question for you here. You mentioned what is real, and I think in our culture, I'll give it like a really brief example of what I'm referring to. So in our culture, about some of the most basic things, we seemingly, if you assert that something can be determined to be real, you can be now labeled as like bigoted or hateful. So so the idea of knowing what is real, and that is kind of a starting point for making ethical judgments and stuff, sounds almost, at least in the culture that we are living in right now, in Canada, it'll be in the same in the United States and other parts of the Western world, that almost seems like a fantasy to get to the point it's like we can agree on what is real. And so given that seems to be the cultural moment we're living through, and there's you touched on a whole bunch of the reasons that has been building over centuries about how we got to this point. And I can be frustrated about that, or just accept that I'm living through this moment and there's nothing I can do about it. And I believe that God put me here and I can do what I can do in this moment. For someone like yourself, if you were to give advice to guys like Rigel and I, especially Rigel and I are both expecting to be fathers for the first time, God willing, in a number of months here and stuff. So thinking about the future of our culture, the culture that we live in, and where we're at, someone like you, knowing what you do about AI, seeing how it's impacting our society and stuff. I'm not asking you to be an optimist or a pessimist. What advice would you have, either informed from a faith-based perspective or a philosophical perspective, about those of us living in this culture where what is real seems to be something we can't even agree upon? What would be your advice for us?
Sure. As an academic, my default is let's go back to the books. Okay. So one is know your enemy, in the sense that the enemy is not other people, but it's the ideology that possesses them, because that's what ideologies do. Like I said, ideologies are a low resolution way of looking at the world, which means that it's very easy. They're very attractive because I just have to memorize this list of things, right? And whenever someone says this, I just say that as a response, right? It's a default way of looking at the world. And the world is a complex system. And like I said, complex systems resist simple solutions. Just not possible to capture the world with an ideology. So they possess people. So one good starting point is understanding how we got here. Because if you don't understand how we got here, well, I'm not saying a return to the past, but kind of a way forward that realizes the errors of the way, right? Why we got to where we are, and then how we can recover an idea of the common good, because we've abandoned the common good as an ideal, because whether it's slightly before the Enlightenment, even with the Protestant Reformation, which led to a whole different movement within theology itself and a way of looking at theology. It's a very strong subjectification, the turn to the subject, which was a huge emphasis within the 20th century. And I think of an important one, but people tend to fall directly into camps, because I think an authentic objectivity is the fruit of an authentic subjectivity. We can't deny our subjectivity, right? But just because we focus on subjectivity doesn't mean we have to abandon objectivity. And I think that's why I adopt Bernard Lonergan, because I think he gives us the most comprehensive account of how an authentic subjectivity, its fruits are perforce a real objectivity, right? Like, I mean, ontologically objective, right? I can't go into that now because, like I said, complex problems, complex solutions. In order to go into this, Lonergan spent 700 or so pages just trying to explain how to get to objectivity. So it would be, I would be doing a disservice, it'd be disrespectful, and I would be utterly incapable of explicating that in just a few minutes, like, because it's complex, right? So I would say is, how do we get here? And I think whether requires a certain degree of historical consciousness, of understanding that many of the not only what we believe, if we believe anything at all, but how we come to believe something, is nothing other than the process of osmosis, a naturalization, right? Like I said, how many people that affirm a degree of moral relativism even know what moral relativism is? Right? It's not. They don't know what moral relativism is. It's internal incoherence, logical incoherence, right? And then they go, well, logic, what is logic, right? So then they just keep going on and on into a reductio ad absurdum. But so it's understanding how we got here. Once you have a comprehensive understanding of how we got here, well, then you have to be ready to give a defense of the hope that's within you, right? So that means adopting apologetics. I think that in the West, there's been a rebirth, a new apologetics that's coming up because of a realization that, for whatever historical reasons, the church is very much to blame also for a lack of proper catechesis when it comes to even apologetics. I had to learn apologetics on my own because no one taught it to me. And there's a whole host of reasons, whether it's social, cultural, political dynamics within the church itself and society, and maybe certain priorities that overlooked the necessity of apologetics. But if you're able to give a good defense of that hope that's within you, right? Whether it's through the use of the formal proofs of God's existence, for example, as a starting point, because how can you get to an ethics from a purely materialistic point of view? You can't. You're already, it's already begging the question. You've already inserted within the premises the conclusion, right? You already asserted through osmosis again, a materialism, an atheism, right? Because I don't believe you can have a materialist atheist ethics, right? An objective ethics, right? And the heat death of the universe would render everything meaningless in the end. In that perspective, it would just simply be a type of pragmatism, right? A type of emotivism. I feel this is good, and that's it, right? And we see this feeling culture, right? I am nothing other than what I feel, and what I feel changes not only from day to day, but from hour to hour, even from moment to moment, right? Which puts us in a state of pure immanence. I am nothing other than what I am in the moment that I am that thing. I have no interiority. I have no depth, right? I am only that thing that I am when I'm doing that thing that I'm doing, right? That's pure immanence. It's unsustainable, right? It means that there is no past, there's no future, there's only the pure present, right? And that's a dangerous philosophy. And we're seeing the fruits of that. So I think historical consciousness, so study a little bit how we got here, look at the connections between the rise of the Enlightenment and its relation to the thought that was birthed in the Enlightenment, people like Kant in particular, who denied absolute objectivity and just looked at experiential and normative objectivity, denied that real transcendent objectivity, how that is also the fruit of the Protestant Reformation, how that kind of Protestant thought has essentially saturated Western culture, and how that has had an influence on Western thought. how the different philosophers who I consider to blame for this have essentially trickled down their thought into broader society. You see the thought of Michel Foucault and Derrida and Heidegger also. That's mostly within the German context, but Nietzsche more broadly. But there's always hope. There's philosophers. I'm not saying anything original. There's people who have lamented this for a long time, right? Pope Benedict XVI. He, in Western civilization discussed this already. And that was a while ago. Look at Charles Taylor, The Sources of the Self, right? In which he discusses what is the self, right? He discusses also the buffered self, modernity, the dangers and the impacts of secularization. So once you understand the historical process, once you understand why am I here today, why do I believe what I believe, why do the people around me believe what they believe, and how did they come to believe those things? The process. It's not the content of the belief that really matters, because if there is no method to arriving at the content, well, then the content is without foundation, right? So once we've appropriated, self appropriated, remember what I said, the understanding how my consciousness works, because once I understand how my consciousness works, then I understand when I come to a moment where I must assent to the truth, right? Where I must assent. My consciousness can do nothing else but assent to it, right? I'm forced to. It possesses me, right? The idea grabs me. I don't grab the idea. It's not in here. The idea grabs me, pulls me out of myself, right? That's when you go into the transcendent, right? The realm of the transcendent, the absolute. Once you're there and you understand how this process works, how my mind works, my intentional consciousness, then you can, through the use of a strong base of apologetics, I think then start pushing back and creating culture, not going back to some untenable traditionalism, right? Not falling into the radical progressivism, which is a form also of progressivism, but creating a new culture that's centered around an idea of the common good, recovering the common good, right?
That's brilliant, and I think I'll point as a way of wrapping up here. I'll point to a source that I think is great for a lot of people to do what you've just recommended, which is get a decent understanding of the history of how we got here and everything. And it's the work of Bishop Robert Barron at the Word on Fire Institute, which is actually how Stephen, you and I got connected, because you've done some writing for that, which is great, on the topic of AI specifically. And that organization was founded by Bishop Robert Barron, who has a ton of videos, short lectures, homilies that he's delivered on a variety of different topics, many of them tapping into how we got to where we are today. And okay, what can we do about it now that we're here? Rather than, to your point, Stephen, about romanticizing about a past that probably was never as good as it seems when we're dealing with the chaos in the moment, and focusing on, okay, what can we do now that we're here? So we'll put some information in the show notes for that, and we'll also include links to Stephen's work that he's done for Word on Fire, which I think is a great starting point for AI specifically, and the conversation we've had here about human consciousness. Rigel, do you want to wrap us up with a quick prayer here?
For sure. One last thing from me as well is this might seem like an oversimplification, but kind of a good takeaway from me, the separation between AI and human consciousness. If all the texts that existed in the world were atheistic, AI would be an atheist. But those of us, who are Christian, who have seen God as the objective truth, even if all the texts in the world were atheistic, we would still be Christians. And I feel like that's just a good summary of the difference between the two. And so with that, we'll wrap up in prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, we give you thanks for bringing us all together today to have this conversation. We are discussing matters that are very relevant in today's world, this world that you created for us and put us in. We are to live in this world, but not be of it. Help us to affect change through this conversation. Help us to enlighten people, to give them the knowledge that they need to go out and seek truth themselves. We pray especially for Stephen and the work that he's doing. We pray that it's fruitful, leads him in the direction that he wants, but we always pray that you keep us on the path that you want us to walk. And we pray for leaders of technological developments across the world, that they see you as truth and create technologies that will lead people closer to the truth rather than farther away from it. We pray all this in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Rigel, for that. As always, thank you, Steven, so much for your time, for your wisdom. Like I said, there's probably like 50 conversations we could have coming out of the things that you highlighted there. So thank you so much, and we'll try to find a time to have you back again in the future.
I appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, everybody.
bless.
Thank you again for tuning in. This has been the Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis podcast. God bless you.